Hello, everybody. Welcome back to class. Hopefully, you just watched lecture 9 and are here for lecture 10. This one's going to be a little bit shorter because the previous one ran long, and I don't want to take up too much of your time this week. Oh, shoot. I'm not sharing my screen yet. Share screen. There we go. Anyway, my goal is never to take up your whole week with these. These lectures are intended to be a supplement to readings and not a replacement. That's just how online classes work. Lectures smaller, discussion is more, reading is more. Anyway, welcome back to our course on memes and meme culture. Lecture 10, cats. I don't know about you, but for me, my first experience to memes was the whole I can't has cheeseburger thing. It's what I think of when I think of memes. I'm older than you. Anyway, today we are looking at case studies in misconduct, examining historical and social contexts. I have several case studies for you, two of which come from our textbook, two of which do not. I wanted to limit it to 4, again, for time and just for my own sanity. I don't like looking at ways that people have done the wrong thing. So, what else do we say here? Nothing. Let's just get into it. So first, Bjorn Lomborg's misuse of climate data. Our textbook talks about this one. Bjorn Lomborg, he would call himself an environmental scientist, and he has a book called The Skeptical Environmentalist. Even before it was published, there were a series of articles that came out saying this guy is misusing climate data. What's he trying to say in his research? Is he a climate denier? That's going to depend on who you ask. That's kind of a spectrum. But in general, his point, along with many others who do similar research, is that climate change should not be a big worry because modern science will take care of it. The long and short of it is that the solution to modern problems is modern solutions. It's the Dave Chappelle meme, right? But how does he get there? That's more of an issue because there are people making similar arguments that don't misuse data, right? There's the Breakthrough Institute, who I would personally disagree with, but I wouldn't say they're doing misconduct like Lomborg is here because he's manipulating data. He's trying to say that climate change will not be as impactful as it is and we don't need to worry about it. Others are saying, yes, it's a huge problem, but continued scientific research will solve that problem, that we should go forward instead of going back. Lomborg is just saying, it's not really an issue. Don't worry about it. And what have been the consequences of this? Well, none really. He's widely disregarded by scientific consensus, but what does that mean for him? I don't know. He's still collecting checks. His book hasn't been pulled from shelves, and he continues to downplay the dangers of climate change. The next one we want to look at is the Piltdown Man. This was another one from our textbook, and I chose it because it almost seems like a positive piece of scientific misconduct. It was done on purpose, right? It was a hoax that there were hoaxsters who in the early 1900s faked archaeological findings to lend support to and then pull the rug out from underneath this idea of British supremacy. There had been discoveries of cave paintings and Neolithic bones in France and Germany, and many British scientists were keen to get in on the action because they wanted to believe that Britain was the cradle of civilization and was the best country there ever was for all of history. And so the Piltdown Man was planted in a gravel pit, and fake evidence was placed around him, including a Neolithic cricket bat. And what happened? Well, people continued to believe the increasingly ridiculous evidence that was being pushed out, largely because they wanted to believe it. The Mertonian norms of being impartial were not being followed here. And we could also say the same thing is happening with Lomborg on the previous slide. The difference is that the people who falsified this data were trying to prove a point, and they were not following organized skepticism. They were not following disinterestedness, and neither is Lomborg, but that's what's happening here in all these cases, really. Case study number 3, Monsanto, and I'll show you the article for this one, actually. So here's the piece. It's from Vanity Fair. And what are they talking about? They're detailing how Monsanto uses their patents on seeds to try and push small farmers out of the market so that they can hold a greater supply of the world's food share. I will put the link there. I think this one's really interesting. They don't have any graphs or charts that I can show you. But what's the problem there? What's going on first? PowerPoint is not responding. Oh no, I've lost my slide. So they hold patents on specific genetic variations of crops. These are genetically modified organisms, and the problem is not, and I'll state it here at the top, that they are causing harm to human bodies. Nobody's being poisoned by these plants. That's not the problem of the genetically modified organisms here. The problem is that these seeds are engineered for profitability over sustainability. They, in fact, will change the quality of your soil so that only Monsanto crops can be grown from there on out. They also will occasionally spread to another field, in which case the farmer who lives next door has not paid for the intellectual property rights to that seed. And if Monsanto catches them with that seed on their land, which they do by hiring private investigators to sneak onto small farms and look for the particular plant, they will sue you. And in many cases, they will take your farm away from you. This is all part of a larger project for what they would say is to, it's just business. We're just trying to make money. Others would say this is an attempt to gain a monopoly on the global food supply chain. Ugh, the global food supply chain. Don't know why my voice got so high there. Sorry. People like Vandana Shiva are doing fantastic research on this. I would recommend her to anybody. And the ethics here, is Monsanto being punished for this? No. They have had to pay the occasional legal fine, but realistically, they're going to continue to rake in money, and they do still hold the intellectual property rights to their crops. That has not been outlawed, and they will continue to sue you and poison the earth for profit. I know I don't sound very impartial here, but that's because I'm not. Another one that's a little more famous, the tobacco industry. I don't know about you, maybe I'm not hip to youth media anymore, but when I was growing up, watching cartoons, there were always these really scary commercials about the dangers of smoking, and they would explain in ways that children would understand that cigarette companies continue to lie to the public about the dangers of cigarettes. They would show these old ads and clips about, how Lucky Strike cigarettes make you thinner, things like that, or how they marketed cigarettes as a tool of feminism. It was, torches of freedom, they called them, and it was all designed to make money. And they also would show that, in fact, the cigarette companies knew how dangerous their product was decades before the average consumer did. Researchers were hired by companies like Philip Morris, who owned Marlboro, to study the harmful effects of tobacco use. And what did they do? Well, that data was obscured or manipulated to make cigarettes seem safer than they really were. This is why light cigarettes exist. The data was put out to make it seem like they were healthier. In truth, it turned out that people actually smoked more of them and were more susceptible to lung cancer because of it, but that data was obscured. And what were the consequences from this misconduct? Very little in terms of consequences for the tobacco industry. There were innumerable cancer cases, and still are, and deaths from this misinformation campaign, but these companies are still going. Philip Morris is still raking in money. Have they faced consequences for their misconduct? Not so much. Sorry about that. When I do all this talking, my throat gets dry. So what can we learn from these examples? Well, each of these case studies contains some violation of Merton's norms. Whether it's universalism, where they already had a set truth that they wanted, or communism, where, like in the Monsanto example, their research is patented. They are holding on to something that could feed more people, and they are using it in a way that generates profit instead of generating benefit for people. What about disinterestedness? Every single one of these cases, this might be the biggest problem, is that this is research done with an agenda, that people want a certain result. And so they are doing research to gain that certain result. What about organized skepticism? Again, we might say that's the same problem. is that there is a presupposition that wants to be proved. Maybe not so much in the Monsanto case because they're not trying to prove anything. They're just trying to engineer plants for profit. But there's no adherence to the Mertonian norms here. And if there were, these might not be cases of misconduct. What else can we say? Well, media plays an interesting role here, right? Because in some cases, media is more helpful than others. In the case of the cigarette example, enterprising anti-cigarette ad campaigns turned out to be one of the best tools that were usable to get that information out to the public. In the case of the skeleton found in England, well, media kind of kept the problem going by siding with the people who didn't want it to be a hoax. What we're trying to get at here is that misconduct is often messy. What constitutes misconduct can be hard to define. Looking at FFP, which is fraud, falsification, and plagiarism, some of these examples don't really fit that. Monsanto, for example, is not committing any kind of fraud. It's not falsifying data. It's not plagiarizing anybody, unless you want to say that they're plagiarizing nature itself by patenting a seed, but that becomes a little iffy. But maybe this FFP definition doesn't hit everything. In which case, what do we do? How do we widen that definition to fit cases like this? The cigarette companies were fraudsters, but others are not. Is purposefully misinterpreting data, is that falsifying? It's a gray area. So what do we say? The search for clear and consistent criteria, it reminds me a lot of one of the major projects of modern philosophy, like we talked about with Francis Bacon and Descartes in the lectures for last week, that it's really the project there has been to make all knowledge as clear and distinct as possible by breaking it down into smaller parts. And this is not as doable with ethics unless, of course, you hold to one of the ethical frameworks we've talked about. Maybe if you're a utilitarian, you could do this, and there certainly could be a utilitarian interpretation of some of these where, using the Monsanto one as an example, they would say, look, does it hurt some small farmers? Sure, but more people get to eat. The food is cheaper. The food is easier to produce. And so, distribution of harms and goods, it's the most good to the most people. It's the least harm to the least people. And sorry if you're on the bottom of that, but that's how it goes. Our other ethical frameworks might take issue with that, especially, well, all of them really. Then there's a question of cultural differences, right? And this one, I don't think it comes out in any of the case studies we looked at, but it does come to mind for me in terms of who gets credit. Because in some cultures, yeah, you're not going to get credit if you're the guy at the bottom of the hierarchy. And in other cultures that are more egalitarian, they might push back against the idea of hierarchy and everybody's going to get equal credit. So it's kind of a mess. And do our rules for misconduct need to be culturally specific? Well, I don't know, maybe. Shifting gears a little bit, why does misconduct happen? And I will be repeating myself a little bit here, but it's worth repeating. So big one is, there's a motivation for profit. And that I think could be summed up as the biggest reason for corporate misconduct. There's money to be made. Manipulating scientific data is a way to make money, and we're not going to suffer consequences for it anyway. So why not do it? But for most people, particularly in the university setting, money's it's a factor, but not in the same way, right? Like the research enterprise is competitive. It always is, it always has been. The thing is publish or perish. And the need to stay employed, to stay relevant so that you can continue to stay employed, is at times going to outweigh any higher notions you might have of morality or scientific goodness. Especially when times are tough and academic positions are getting cut, or you want to push through from being adjunct faculty into full faculty. Yeah, I mean, the temptation to falsify results so that you can be considered employable, that's a real temptation. And because, like we said, the enterprise is bigger than it's ever been, you just might not get caught. And then another factor here that I think is really interesting is new media. What is new media? Blogs, internet TV, YouTube. In some way, this is new media, although a very different form of it because these videos are just for a small audience. But digital media typically shows you what you want to see and then will continue to shape your worldview by giving you more things that you wanted to see. This is how a lot of people get caught up in anti-vaccine research, research in quotation marks there, because they want that result. And so they're seeing things that will give them their desired result. And like I said in the previous lecture, the average science blog, whether it's written by a high school student or somebody with a PhD, or if it's written by this or that think tank and their funding is obscured, that's going to be more readily available than a lot of peer-reviewed research is. Not only can you get to it faster through Google than you can through any of these journal search terms because their websites aren't great, it's also free and probably written in a way that the average person can read. What does that do? Well, it means that we can't rely on just the system to take care of it. We need our own specific norms, and we need the people doing that writing to adhere to norms as well. Then there's the question of relevance to politics, right? And climate science is, again, the biggest example that I can think of where political agendas often change how data is presented or interpreted. I don't want to get into like a conservative versus liberal divide here, but if, for example, your political party takes a lot of money from oil companies, well, then you are going to be very inclined to only present the data in a way that helps those oil companies that are giving you money. And, Mertonian norms would say, hold on, this is supposed to be communal. This is supposed to be universal. The truth is the truth no matter who says it. Just give us the facts. And that is not done in the political arena. So that becomes another issue for misconduct. So what's next? And I know this lecture was pretty short, but again, I went way over time in the previous one. So first thing I want you to do is read The Importance of Being Right versus the Importance of Being Earnest. PDF is available on Canvas. Same with this Broad and Wade piece, The Fraud and the Structures of Science. Then I want you to watch lecture 11, which will deal in those. And in that lecture, I'll also be talking about, comparing and assessing different explanations of misconduct. And then after that, it's not really an official lecture, but your midterm is coming up. And so I'm doing a midterm review video where I will walk you through the structure of the midterm and what kind of questions you can expect and where you can get them. So please watch that one. I'll also put a link to that video in the midterm itself since I'm giving you unlimited time. Final thing for this week is, and you have to do that this week, is post in our weekly discussion forum. Our question for the week is, I want you to answer the following question. Normal rules apply, normal citations apply. As an aside, please put page numbers on your citations. That helps me a lot to make sure that you actually did the reading. I haven't been dinging you on that because I want to be kind and this is a weird time in life. But, in the name of being just upfront with you all about it, other lecturers are going to ding you on that in the future, so I don't want to set you up with a system that's more relaxed to set you up for failure in later classes. I'm also not going to punish you for it, though. Anyway, what's the question for this week? What are the advantages and disadvantages of limiting the definition of scientific misconduct to fraud, falsification, and plagiarism? So, what are the advantages and disadvantages of this FFP definition? If that definition is too narrow, how should we replace it? And finally, how should the consequences for questionable research practices be determined, and who should determine these consequences? I know those are kind of broad questions, those are big questions, but I think that you guys are really capable of this. I want to make the questions as relevant as I can, and I'm seeing a lot of great discussion in our forums. So, big questions this time. Don't just pick one of them. I want you to answer all of them. I'll make sure that that's reflected in the post. And yeah, you all have a good day. I will see you next week. Stop sharing and